Well, some very interesting news coming out of Minneapolis, which I'm barely even thinking about Minneapolis because, we've had all this unrest throughout the rest of the country. But the whole start of this current issue, this current uprising in America, all these riots, was caused by was a reaction to the actions of some Minneapolis police officers. And so in Minneapolis now, they're trying to address whatever systemic problems they think might be, embedded in that department. And they're actually considering disbanding the police department entirely. Now, at first hand, that does sound kind of crazy. Although, as someone who's spent a lot of time on the fringes of libertarianism, this is actually something that gets debated about a lot in academic circles. Hey, what would you ANCAPs do if you don't even believe in a minimal state? If you go so much further than, say, the likes of Ayn Rand or somebody like that, or of Thomas Jefferson or these other, small government types, how would you go about enforcing basic laws? How do you, stop murderers or, apprehend burglars? And interestingly enough, even though I've been talking about how this is, largely a left-wing movement, and typically the left is not exactly on board with eliminating the government entirely, their hatred for the police is actually making them explore these sorts of ideas. And they're talking about things which, at least on the surface, and I'm sure that the way they're implemented, of course, would be key, and they might be implemented very poorly. But on the surface, they're these so-called solutions. I shouldn't say so-called because that makes it sound like a pejorative, but the solutions that these councilmen and councilwomen are putting forward in Minneapolis as to replace the police department might have some promise to them. As of right now, they're only really speaking platitudes about how, it should be community oriented, and we should be able to deal with parking tickets without drawing a weapon and things like that, which, hey, I'm very on board with that. That sounds like kinds of things that, people like me have been saying for a long time about the police. That, having all these laws that must be enforced at the barrel of a gun, is going to create a rather tyrannical environment depending on, what the laws are. And when you task the police with enforcing all of these, very minute and sort of bureaucratic laws that these cities put forward, like the cigarette tax in New York that essentially killed Eric Garner, people don't really pay much attention to, they pay attention to the fact that a cop killed Eric Garner, but they don't think that hard about, why he killed him, or why he, ended up putting him in a chokehold, which killed him. The whole situation with Eric Garner was that he was selling cigarettes that without paying essentially the New York tariffs. New York, they don't call it a tariff. I think they call it a sin tax. But he didn't pay the tax on cigarettes that he brought into New York. He bought them outside New York City, brought them in, and was selling them to people. He was running a small business, which you can't do. And so the cops had to enforce that tax. And so they, the only thing the cops really can do is use violence if somebody is not going to obey the law. That's what they're there for. They're there to enforce it. And so you end up with, in these cities that have lots of, very particular laws and a lot of people stacked on top of each other, a lot of situations where citizens end up in very uncomfortable situations with the police. And that's why, somebody like me who grew up in a much less densely populated area has never had as many, bad encounters with the police. I get profiled quite a bit because I happen to drive, beat-up old truck. So whenever I'm in a sort of a nicer area than I usually, occupy, I draw, a negative attention, and I've been pulled over a few times just based on that. But I generally, am not, don't have a very negative interactions, with the cops that pull me over. But depending on where you live, the cops are going to have a different attitude and are going to, approach citizens differently. And so, like I said, depending on what they come up with, these folks in Minneapolis might actually do something good. And I've been very critical of this whole movement because I don't have any faith, or I don't put any stock in their or goodwill, behind these people. I generally do not think that the folks behind this movement are good people that I would want to sit down and have a conversation with. My general attitude has been that they're trying to subvert a society and disrupt the social order. But if something good can come out from all that, I'm not going to complain about the results, even if I'm always going to be very critical of the methods. So what basically am I talking about? What kind of solution, alternative to how urban policing is conducted today? How could that work? Well, essentially, the biggest thing is that if you don't have a violent police force like this, if you abolish your police force, the first thing you would need to do with it, because there has to be something that replaces it to serve a similar purpose, because you need somebody to hunt down the killers and the rapists and the burglars and the robbers. So if you create a new force, one of the first things you want to make sure is that these new cops, or if you don't want to call them cops, if you want to call them neighborhood patrols or something like that. You can't have them handing out these citations constantly to people. You can't have them trying to hunt down people and charge them money for whatever sorts of little petty things that these cities come up with, to try and earn revenue. The city and the department are going to have to give up that revenue. And that's one way. That's a very easy way to have a more, cozy relationship with the populace, is to not put them on edge to where they constantly have to watch their back because the cop's always looking to hand them out tickets. And so that's something very basic that they could do. Limit the role of the police to dealing with violent crime. And then, the second most obvious thing that they could do is localize these police departments. So instead of having, one big police department that, polices the entire city, you have a bunch of little ones. Similar to the way the precincts work now, but the precincts would be completely separated from one another. And this is certainly, what I'm talking about is not an anarcho-capitalist situation or anything like that. I'm not getting into libertarian theory here. But what I'm talking about is that in the context of the government that we have now, what is something conceivable that these cities might come up with to try and actually reform their policing system? And so I think that's probably the number one thing that they could do that would make the biggest difference, is if the only folks who are actually policing the area are locals from that part of town. Because that also helps them, get to know the area a little bit better. Because a big problem of why these urban cops and the urbanites have so much friction between them is because the cops are much more likely to suspect these folks of being potential criminals, of being a threat. Whereas in small towns, the cops can be a little more at ease if they know most of the people. So if you take these, big city police departments and you break them up into essentially small town police departments, and you, for the purposes of policing, you turn each of the, police precincts, or maybe even smaller. If you turn neighborhoods into small towns, then that would solve a lot of your problems. Because then on the citizen side, it'd be much harder for them to sort of abstract away the humanity of the police. They wouldn't think of the police as one big blob. They would think of, they would think of specific cops that they know in their neighborhood. It would humanize them. And a lot of departments have been trying to do similar things like this by having community outreach events, which, I don't know to what extent they've really done any good. Because if you think of a place like New York, the NYPD is a massive organization. And at the end of the day, the NYPD is the NYPD. You don't really know Officer O'Malley. Now, the third thing that I think that a lot of these cities might possibly do is actually reform some of their own laws. Because at the end of the day, the police cannot brutalize you if they don't have some mandate from the government. Like I was saying with the situation in New York with Eric Garner, the only reason why they were, were manhandling Eric Garner in the way they were was because Michael Bloomberg said, "Here, I want you to enforce this tax by any means necessary." And so the cops were just following orders, to quote the Nuremberg defense. So in addition to getting rid of petty citations that make people resent the police, these cities will have to also decriminalize a lot of things and reduce sort of the severity of enforcement and really limit the policing to dealing with violent crimes. So these are just some general ideas that popped into my head after reading the article about what they're discussing in Minneapolis. Again, this is not what I would ideally come up with, but these are some things that are positive, in the right direction, and that I think are reasonable and could be implemented to some degree. Either one or all of these measures. And there's still pretty broad ideas that would depend on how they're implemented, whether or not they succeed. But as a general rule, social cohesion is going to be maximized when you have the relationship between people and government localized to the maximum degree possible. Perhaps you could even have sheriffs that are elected for each of these smaller communities, because after all, the term sheriff, the root in English means the reeve of the shire. These were people who would direct the police in small towns. That's what a sheriff did. He enforced the laws, on behalf of his community, not on behalf of some, massive modern metropolis. And of course, cities in America don't even have elected sheriffs. They have police chiefs who are appointed by, the mayor, who's typically elected. But if people, in these smaller communities had, the ability to elect the leader of, of their police department, well then, they would have much more of a say and have much more feeling that they have a control over what's happening to them. Even though I'm not a huge fan of democracy, it does help in making people feel like they have a say in what's going on. And again, especially if it's more localized, democracy is much more effective in enhancing social cohesion the more localized it is. Perhaps these cities could essentially set up policing districts that would be determined by population. Let's say every 50,000 people elects their own local police chief. Or maybe it would be based on the boundaries of traditional neighborhoods in these cities. So like in Manhattan, for example, Harlem or Hell's Kitchen, or any of these other smaller neighborhoods, not full boroughs even, would elect their own sheriff type of person. But even though this is not my ideal situation, it's still relatively idealized, and when it comes to government reforms, normally the reforms move in the wrong direction. The government always reforms itself in a way to become more, intrusive. There was a lot of reform back in city government around the start of the 20th century, which gave us sort of these modern city governments, to where you have these highly centralized governments. Things like the school board, for example, used to be based, sort of on the neighborhood level. And that was all reformed away. That was a big urban reform movement back then. And so I'm not too helpful, but I'll at least give them the benefit of the doubt for now and see what the folks in Minneapolis come up with. And if it is something similar to what I've discussed today, particularly the matter about electing local police chiefs, I would probably advocate for it in the future. So with that said, I know today's video was a little more lighter in tone, and I'm trying to get away from the gloom and doom just because it's weighing too much on me. We'll see how things fare for the rest of the week, but for now, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.